the science text should include an extensive representation of Darwin's theory of evolution. The thing that Darwin did not know at that time, 160 years ago, was the organization within the living cell. The present state of the science is that the living cell is so complicated, so complex, that it could not have occurred purely by chance. And although Darwin should be included, he should be included at a historic development, in the development of science, and not as contemporary science as we know it from laboratory experiments today. Presenting Darwin as fact would be nothing more than junk science.
I reviewed Pearson's Biology by Miller and Levine this year in 2004. This year I documented 38 factual errors and found it even worse in compliance with critiques related to origin of life and evolutionary theory. The text ignores decades of development in evolutionary theory. Parts are up to 50 years out of date. For example, neither the terms neo-Darwinian synthesis nor epigenetics can be found. The same publisher, Campbell and Reese, is much better. In 1980, Harvard paleontologist Stephen J. Gould said Darwinism is effectively dead despite its persistence as textbook orthodoxy, and it's not even made it into the history of the book I reviewed. It appears to me this text treatment of evolution is actually dishonest. The 2004 edition compared anatomical and molecular relationships, and the teacher was instructed to be sure the student understood they were in conflict. This fact has been deleted from the new edition, and the student is told instead every scientific test has supported Darwin's basic idea. Nothing could be further from the truth. You have any questions?
I think you went under your 2 minutes. Ms. Hardy?
Just curious, the text that was written, and you said in 2004, it has different authors?
Same authors.
Same authors?
Yep. Same author, same publisher.
But they changed it up?
Well, you know, lots have gone on in 10 years. This
Well,
has
yeah.
got a lot of changes in it, but this is a backward change.
Made a step back?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Mercer?
Just 2 questions. What was your PhD again, I'm sorry?
My PhD is in chemical engineering. I worked in reaction kinetics, catalysis, polymerization.
And you mentioned a conflict in 2 areas that were not, what are the 2 areas again? You mentioned, I think the previous version of the textbook had a conflict and you used 2 terms.
Actually told the teacher to make sure the student knew that molecular trees and taxonomic trees didn't always match in conflict, exactly what it says, and yet a different sequence of genome was used in an example that's in this year's book, and the student is told instead there are no problems. In fact, the statement is it improves the accuracy of. That's what it says.
Thank you. I remember that, the molecular versus taxonomic, they are different, and I remember that in the past before you got.
Not this book.
Let me address the battle against science and the denial of global climate change. Global climate change is a fact. It is a fact, and some book revisions being considered. The only people who doubt the reality of climate change do not understand it, or sadly believe it is an expression of faith to deny it. United Nations scientific consensus statements are not opinion polls. Consensus is reached by logical reasoning at meetings of hundreds of top scientists. The gist of this consensus is that they agree that the report is of the highest scientific integrity and truly reflects the state of knowledge. Final statements include opinions of delegates from every country, including the United States.
Okay, thank you, sir. You wrap up your sentence.
Okay.
Or does he
The Berlin Wall stood for mind control. We struggle to tear it down. Let's don't build another wall.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
John McElroy, followed by Franklin Neal.
Well, thank you. Even though these biology books are full of unsubstantiated dogmatic statements supporting evolution, there are still two major reasons why you should adopt these books. First, by so doing, you will strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution. There are some hidden jewels in these texts just waiting to be mined by inquisitive students that can destroy evolution. In 2009, when the board adopted these new science standards, the evolutionists were painted into a corner. The authors were required to provide scientific evidence for explanations of the sudden appearance and stasis of groups in the fossil record and the complexity of the cell. And most importantly, to identify the specific pages where they were to do so. These sections are the hidden jewels. In the following week, American Association for the Advancement of Science reported new science standards for Texas schools strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. The adoption of these books represents the final blow because despite their boastful assertions of robust evidence for evolution, when you actually read those identified sections, the hidden jewels, you will find the evidence incredibly weak to non-existent. And if there's no evidence, there's no evolution. Science, test explanations, classically with controlled experiments, and historically by collecting evidence. Genetics is an excellent example of classical testability. Mendel, in 1865, after growing 29,000 pea plants, empirically deduced the laws of inheritance. Continental drift is an excellent example of historical testability. The obvious fit of the coastlines of Africa and South America, similar geologic formations, discovery of the mid-Atlantic ridge and seafloor spreading make a convincing argument. Likewise, evolution is tested historically. Evolutionists need a lot of evidence. How much? Simply they must provide enough to explain the origin of everything else in the book. Here's one book's index. 4,000 items. Here is one item, biochemical complexity. How much evidence do the authors provide? They just wave the magic wand of words and come up with some simple explanations. Just those stories. The second reason I ask you to adopt these books is because they happen consistently, coincidentally, to support what the Bible says. The Bible says God created all life after their kind. What we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. We see myriads of things that replicate themselves and can be organized into distinct classifications.
Dr. McElroy, go ahead and finish since you were a former board member. We'll let you finish.
Well, I only got about 20 seconds.
That's true.
Not only does, what we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. But what we see in these books supports what the Bible says. Test it for yourself. Open it random, any page, and ask yourself if the description or illustration you find supports the claims of the Bible or of evolution. Even the units on evolution support what the Bible says. Because, as demonstrated, they don't even support evolution. Ironically, evolutionists argue that creationists want to force their religious views in the text, but just the teaching of biology does that, and teaching evolution demonstrates that's not how God did it. Since true testable science trumps dogmatism, strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution, support the Bible, and adopt these books. Thank you.
Questions, board members? Mrs. Knight.
That's fine, y'all.
Mike. Right, but these are new mics, audience. That's why we're learning.
Could you clarify for me, Dr. McElroy, when you adopt these books, which books are you talking about?
All of them. If you look on the reverse side of the page, or the first page I gave you, those are the areas of the main publishers, areas that have to deal with sudden appearance and stasis and the complexity of the cell. I want you to adopt these books because if you read those sections and those pages, they have to at least give a hint to the origin of everything else in the biology book. And they're weak. You test things in science. We have a definition of science that was also included in our new standards. It says science is the use of evidence to make testable explanations. You test it two ways in science. Historically, it's the way you test evolution. You cannot evolve something in a lab. I mean, you can claim some stuff, but you don't evolve a new cat or something like that in the lab. You're going to have to look at the historical evidence. We have identified, those are the hidden jewels in our books. Read those pages. I've read them. They're weak. In the fossil record, they talk about sudden appearance and stasis, where they tried to explain it. One publisher doesn't even deal with it. They ignore it, their 50% rule. But the ones that do talk about punctuated equilibrium. Well, that was an idea to try to get around the idea that the fossil record does not support evolution. And then if you look at the complexity of the cell, they talk about one cell swallows another cell and somehow acquires that cell that gets swallowed up then becomes a chloroplast, becomes a nucleus, becomes a mitochondria. That's weak. They have no evidence of how it did it. And on that chart that I had displayed, I read evolutionist books. This Jerry Cohen in Why Evolution is True, in trying to explain biochemical complexity. This is a book he wrote just 2 years ago about the evidence for evolution, and all you see in there is he says there was a common ancestor of fibrinogen. One little word on that entire 27 square foot chart. He highlights one molecule, fibrinogen, an imaginary common ancestor of a sea cucumber and all us vertebrates, you know, all of us with backbones.
Okay, Mrs. Knight, did that answer your
That's
question?
weak.
No.
Let the students see how weak it is.
What was your question? No, I know your question.
Let the little, no, go ahead.
For the books under King Jewels, and you got the publishers, the 3 publishers, are you saying adopt these books facetiously?
No, no.
These are the ones that address.
No, if you look at the other part of the handout, I gave you 2 articles from Science Magazine
Okay.
right after we passed these standards 4.5 years ago. When we passed these standards, there was a news story that said, and this is the AAAS, the American Association of Advancement of Science. It's their top science journal and the weekly journal in the world, one of the top. You can't get much better than this. In their news story, they said, new science standards for Texas schools strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. 2 weeks later, they interviewed me and one of the authors of the book, and they ran another second story. And in that story, the evolutionists predicted, oh, this has a chance for us to show the robustness of evolutionary theory. I predicted, I can't wait for these books to come out. I've been waiting for 4.5 years. It's 4.5 years later, the books are out. Let the students, the inquisitive students, the ones that are not blind, look at the evidence in these books. They don't even give a hint to explain the complexity. They have to explain the origin of everything else in the book. This is awesome. Let's get these books to the kids. Let them see it. Let that little young student in the classroom say, is this all the evidence that they can give? That's why I think it'll strike a major blow to teaching of evolution, and this could be the final blow. I'm excited. Put those books in there. I don't like the dogmatism about the books, but I like the fact that we've painted them into a corner, and they have no evidence in those books that support evolution. Adopt them.
Okay,
I'm serious.
other questions? Yes, Mr. Ratliff.
Pretty nice. I'm always nice. Okay, I want to make sure I understand your argument. And I promise this isn't a long question. You want us to adopt the books because you believe that the books lack evidence, therefore the books prove that evolution doesn't exist?
I think what we want to do is have our students, using science, if they go to the part of they understand the definition of science, which is in all our new high school science books. It's the use of evidence to make testable explanations. Once they understand what historical science is, like that you show continental drift, one simple separation with 4 facts. Well, how many facts do you need to show evolution? It's in the billions and trillions and trillions. Well, there should be, at least in those sections to explain it, that it should be there. They're not there. And so I'm just hoping a young creationist, young Thomas Ratliff, that's a creationist, will sit there and say, look, is this all the evidence they had? Well, maybe God didn't use evolution to do it.
Okay, let me ask you another question. In the AAAS science journal that you mentioned, the new science standards for Texas schools strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. Isn't that a different statement than strikes a major blow to evolution?
Of course.
So the standard striking a blow as to how it is taught is different than the scientific journal saying that evolution has had a major blow dealt to it.
Well, yeah, but I'll take either one, whatever words that guy.
Okay, because it seemed as though you were implying that the Journal of Science was saying
well, I
that
think we
evolution
can.
Okay, let's stick to the books since
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
here to
that's
talk
fine.
about the textbooks instead of a journal.
Okay, so,
Well, anyway,
so your position is that these books prove that evolution doesn't happen and you want us to adopt them?
no. I did not say prove. I just say the evidence is weak.
Okay, thank you.
I don't prove anything. I may be wrong.
Okay. Mr. Mercer.
Just one question. You had a bullet point that I need to make sure I understand. Stasis explains half of the fossil record, whereas directional change might explain as little as 5%.
Yeah, that's another item a little bit farther down the line. That's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, another top-notch journal, one of the very highest esteem. And yes, stasis is turning out to be something like half of the fossil record, whereas what we would normally expect, mutations plus natural selection to produce directional change, consistent directional change. And this scientist says that no, from his large-scale study of the fossil record, that it's only about 5%. The other 45% is just random relationships, random walks that yields no net change.
Commenters make numerous erroneous statements on evolution. Quote, I feel very firmly that creation science based on biblical principles should be incorporated into every biology book that is up for adoption. Biblical principles are not science-based. So even if there were no First Amendment prohibitions against teaching of religious dogma in public schools, see Edwards versus Aguilar, they do not belong in the science curriculum. Quote, text neglects to tell students that no transitional fossils have been discovered. The fossil record can be interpreted in other ways than evolutionary with equal justification. This comment is simply wrong.
The Texas system to adopt science instructional materials is sick, broken, and corrupt, and it has been for the 33 years I've been
Mr.
appearing here.
Shapersman, excuse me, please don't mention names. I see names on your testimony, but I've already
I'm not
asked.
going to mention those names,
Okay,
Mr. Cargill.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. I've been appearing here for 33 years to advocate for the accuracy and integrity of science education in Texas. Several aggressive and well-known anti-evolutionists and intelligent design creationists were nominated and appointed to all 3 biology material review panels, at least 1 creationist to each panel. This was no accident. The creationists on the 3 biology review panels made many unscientific and nonsensical criticisms of the submitted biology materials. Comments such as the text neglects to tell students there are no transitional fossils, and there should be inclusion of the creation model based on the biblical view of history are simply nonsense. These comments are pseudoscientific, incorrect, and illegal. These changes are not the ones that some state board members really want to make. They want to make changes that weaken and damage evolution instruction so that students will be misled and confused about the ability of evolutionary biology to explain the existence of biological diversity, thus leaving students prey to creationist explanations. These changes will be negotiated with publishers in secret meetings with TEA staff. Alarmingly, I've been told that the negotiated changes publishers are obliged to make will not be made public due to a bogus reason. The changes publishers agree to make with the TEA must be made public just as they were in 2011 so that we can evaluate what damage has been done to scientific accuracy and integrity by this process. Let's not revert to the corrupt decades of the 1970s and 80s when staff negotiated with publishers in secret and the results were not known until the books appeared a year later.
While religious explanations for the history of the earth may be appropriate discussing topics in comparative religion, literature, or philosophy classes, they have no place in the public school science classroom.
I would like to say that teaching both sides of an idea or a theory is the foundation for the development of critical thinking in our students. They must be able to weigh the evidence supporting a theory as well as the evidence that undermines a theory. To not teach both sides of a theory is to prevent them from using their analytical skills to judge between superstition and science, between speculation and common sense, and between hypothesis and fact. When we fail to present the weaknesses of Darwinian evolution, we encourage indoctrination, not critical thinking. I've testified up here before, and even the past textbooks back in 2003 and so forth had no weaknesses whatsoever in the textbook. And I'm talking about just the normal basic weaknesses that high school students of a sophomore level can understand. Things like the fact that mutations don't really encourage, you can't add information to the genome through a mutation, for example, and the natural selection, as we observe it in our real world, is not really encouraged. The mutation or the development of animals into a higher levels, it just does not. So, observed science, testable science, simply works against evolution. It does not work for it.
Having studied the inaccurate critiques by unqualified reviewers of the science textbooks, I feel that some members of the State Board of Education, a government institution, are attempting to sponsor a specific Christian dogma in Texas's science textbooks.
Thank you for having us. I'm a native Austinite, a scientist, and a mother, and I'm here in favor of the current textbook versions. My peers and I agree we must not let our science standards slip. There are real costs to Texans when science education gets compromised. I'll share 4 examples that keep me up at night. 1, this year, Texans paid to investigate and clean up a measles outbreak near Fort Worth. Irresponsible church leaders there had been spreading junk science and discouraging the use of vaccines. Every dollar spent on that mess was needed dearly elsewhere. 2, climate change deniers say that the seas aren't really rising. A century ago, my family came to Texas via Galveston. Now, coastal evacuation routes will soon be below sea level. If denial means we wait for a Katrina-sized disaster, with whole communities cut off and stranded in a storm, we will all suffer at home and in our state budget. 3, Texas students have told me the message in the classroom is that condoms don't work, so don't use them. Without scientifically accurate information, we have the worst teen pregnancy rate in the nation, and Texas taxpayers pay for the majority of births in this state every year. As for evolution, our seniors encounter it every day in our hospitals. Every year, tens of thousands of Texans acquire bacterial and viral infections in hospitals where germs keep evolving whether we teach evolution or not. Texans who don't understand evolution and adaptation may fail to complete their courses of antibiotics, hastening the day when superbugs emerge in our communities. We will not get ahead of these public threats and public costs without accurate science education. We share too much infrastructure and too many community costs to compromise on this. Parents and religious leaders can teach what they want elsewhere. In our classrooms, I stand up for science.
I served on a review panel covering several of the textbooks, and what I want to do is express the frustration that my scientific colleagues and I have in the face of a very flawed review process that allows some panelists to bring an agenda to their reviews which discredit scientific treatment of evolution because they personally reject its validity. This undermines the review process by making false claims of what they consider to be, but are not, factual errors in the submissions. And their arguments, when you read them, often expose an ignorance of the very materials that they are attempting to address.
My name's David Shorman. I've got a PhD from Texas A&M, if you didn't notice already. And I've got degrees from UT as well in science and engineering. I just wanted to talk to you all about some 21st century science stuff. You know, there's no real discussion of 21st century science, what's missing from the books. And one example is epigenetics. That's some new 21st century science. I had to go against my other 2 people to reject the TEAC that didn't have good information on 21st century cell complexity. And I've got a copy of what that looks like from that publisher. They did a great job on it. It says, reading 21st century approaches to understanding cell complexity. It's new 21st century science that helps explain all of these things and helps a student analyze and evaluate pretty much anything that has to do with a cell.
I have one question.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Mercer.
To be clear, this case was in Louisiana. They were going to teach creationism, but would not allow evolution. The court was saying you could teach both.
And what the court, here's my view of it, and your counsel can give his or her view. It was saying creationism as taught from a pure ecclesiastical theological standpoint is forbidden by the First Amendment.
Would be an establishment of religion by teaching it just by itself, yes.
That's right. But when you teach alternative theories in a scientific sense, that is the evidence, examining critically the evidence, that's perfectly acceptable. That's the U.S. Supreme Court.
I have worked as a scientist and engineer for 32 years.
having degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering. Evolution is a theory which has had lots of problems over time. Many of its so-called proofs and just-so stories have been soundly debunked over the past 100 years, yet continue to be presented to students as if there is no alternative analysis. And the history of the many incorrect and fraudulent scenarios of evolution is not told to the students. By not teaching both sides, such presentation does not teach critical thinking. Instead, the presentation perpetuates the indoctrination of a theory which presumes non-theistic, that is, atheistic religion. This includes religions like Buddhism and secular humanism. Atheism itself was also declared by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals to be a religion in 2005. Atheism is a position of faith in something which cannot be proven. That's why they have to read atheist literature, study atheist books, and encourage one another through group meetings. It may seem strange to say that science textbooks can take a religious approach, but when we are talking about a theory which requires billions of years of speculation, when there were no eyewitnesses to collect evidence, we are not talking about a hard science, but one which presumes a worldview, one which presupposes a certain faith about life and origins. The religious perspective of evolution is also made clear by evolution's need to be reinvented. For example, the expected proof from the fossil record is not materialized, and punctuated equilibria, untestable mutational leaps, is now called upon. How can we officially admit that the fossils do not show the evolution of species and not admit the possibility that the theory might be wrong? Not to admit as much is, again, to cling to the theory in faith as a religious dogma. And that is what we have allowed to happen. We have allowed atheistic religious commitment to control the curriculum while claiming it to be science. True science allows debate and controversy, especially in the case of essentially non-testable theory. To stifle that voice is to suppress freedom, to suppress critical thinking, and to adopt a minority religious view to indoctrinate our students.
Earlier this year, we asked biology scholars from the University of Texas and Southern Methodist University to review the biology instructional materials submitted for adoption in Texas. They determined that those materials did a good job of presenting established science when it comes to teaching evolution. I've asked that you have a copy of that report distributed to you today, and I encourage you to consider their recommendations and their reviews in your deliberations of these materials. It will come as no surprise to you that I'd also like to talk about and make some suggested changes for the process you have currently in place for adopting instructional materials. A review of the many problems we found with the process can be instructive as you move forward. First, there are serious questions about the qualifications of some of the people appointed by the review teams to be on the official review teams. I recommend that this board adopt minimum objective qualifications for reviewers, and that the process for appointing people to the review teams, who gets appointed to which team, etc., be made transparent to the public. Teachers and scholars in the subject matter should be the overwhelming majority of those performing these reviews.
I taught Bible to 9th and 10th graders as well as astronomy, and I hope my experience proves illuminating here. I remember discovering the book of Genesis as an adult. I was starting divinity school and found myself home alone on a Saturday night, absorbed and astonished by it. More than anything, it was so unexpected. The only thing that broke Yahweh's spell, stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, on down to Joseph, was my own laughter. Thinking about my friends back home, they were likely out on the town, while here I was, enraptured reading Genesis. I hope I carried this bliss and astonishment into teaching it, bringing teenagers to experience it in its own terms, as it is. That is hard. That is what it demands. But the beauty, the wonder, the humor, the totality and reality of Genesis is trashed if hashed into, quote, creation science based on biblical principles. That is an abomination. Verily, a sin against the Holy Spirit. It's like playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy on a kazoo, running it through an audio analyzer to show the frequencies generated, and then demanding this graph be included in a music appreciation textbook. You cannot know Genesis as it is in its own terms as sacred and allow it to be so profaned. Dear Lord, spare our students from suffering such sin.
Okay, thank you.
There seems to be a point of discussion that is continually researched under Rick Perry's administration, and that is the proposition of young earth creationism being inserted into our youth textbooks, as well as the idea of evolution being some sort of unproven or untested theory. This is all done as a misguided attempt to teach a purely theological controversy that has no place in science classrooms. I believe that the only reason these teach the controversy movements have made it so far, so many times in the past, is because of a few vocal representatives favoring creationist science. Because the reality of the situation is that there is no debate within the scientific community between creationism and evolution. Evolution has proven itself time and time again. More importantly, however, religion and evolution don't have to be taken as opposites. The vast majority of Christian scientists in the nation hold their faith in God tandem to their acceptance of the reality of evolution. The two are not incompatible. And to argue against evolution is to refute something as well established as heliocentrism or gravitational law.
I'm a certified professional geologist licensed by the state of Texas. I am also a consultant for over 15 different school districts. I've served as project geologist on over 30 new schools in the past 20 years, including some private schools. The Earth is approximately 4.54 billion years old, as evidenced by radiometric dating. Evolution is the basis of all modern understanding of biology as well as geology, and we are licensed by the state of Texas.
It's fairly evident from the comments that have been published that there are certainly people out there that would like to water down both the evidence for climate change and also for evolutionary biology. And both of these scientific concepts are very strongly supported by the evidence and are widely accepted by members of the scientific community who study those areas. There are a number of things that have been brought up here today. I would, in 2 minutes, I can't possibly do it, but if you would invite me back, I'd be happy to explain a number of the things that people here claim evolution cannot explain.
In 2009, new science standards were extensively debated, and ultimately the TEKS adopted were motivated by the goal of protecting critical discussion and open debate in the classroom for all scientific subjects and theories, including evolution. Specifically, the TEKS stated that in all fields of science, analyze, evaluate, and critique scientific explanations by using empirical evidence, logical reasoning, and experimental and observational testing, including examining all sides of scientific evidence of those scientific explanations so as to encourage critical thinking by the student.
We've heard a lot of talk about how analyze and evaluate and critical thinking are what we are meant to promote. That's well and good, but you don't need legislation, you don't need standards to make that happen. That's the nature of science class. The only reason that analyze and evaluate and critical thinking have been talked about so much is to sneak creationism into the classroom. That's a common creationist tactic. And we can tell because the same people who are saying that the evolution standards need to be analyzed and evaluated more are the ones who also recommend the creation model based on biblical principles in the science classroom. That's right there. It was in the reviews. There is no doubt about what's happening.
Where unbiased reviewers check for clear lab safety guidelines, thoughtful histories of all sciences, and even correctly formatted species names, review panels captured by ideologues were troublingly selective. These reviews would even have publishers introduce factual errors or reduce coverage of the TEKS, building flaws and voids into the foundation of students' knowledge. For instance, one reviewer claimed that covering genetic drift and recombination as evolutionary mechanisms was false and violated TEKS 3A. Not only have those evolutionary mechanisms been recognized for decades, but TEKS 7F correctly requires coverage of them. These agenda-driven reviewers often relied on materials from creationist organizations to attack accurate science in the textbooks. Introducing such errors and ideology into these books would build cracks, voids, and flaws directly into the foundation of Texas students' science education.
Okay, Mr. Bradley.
So did you threaten to sue us?
Yes, sir.
I don't know, I heard it. Usually when someone does that, I stop the conversation and point them to the courthouse.
I don't even think you'd have to wait for the ACLU to sue you. You could be sued by a number of people.
You know, just clarification of and we were sued by a publisher on the environmental science textbook. And we've got great lawyers too, and the state prevailed.
Congratulations.
In order to prepare our children for college-level courses and the jobs of the 21st century, Texas science textbooks must contain scientifically accurate explanations of evolution and climate change. I am troubled by the fact that publishers may alter scientific information about evolution and climate change based on criticism from some of these unqualified reviewers. So far, the public has not been able to see the changes the publishers are proposing to make to meet these objections from these reviewers.
Yesterday I took a quick survey at the research department of a high-tech firm where I work, and of the 20 or so people in that department, I could only identify 2 who actually received their college education in Texas. That seems to be a very typical situation in many high-tech firms. Well, it's great we're able to attract a lot of talent from all over. I'm rather disappointed that we're not doing a better job at developing our own talent here in Texas.
Please filter out the irresponsible revisions these deniers and pseudoscientists may be trying to use to further their own agendas via our textbooks. Consider whether the changes they're advocating would be supported or helpful at institutions of higher education such as the University of Texas.
Because I teach non-science students, I recognize that many of them may feel nervous about taking a class in evolution. And so I do stress to them that I'm not telling them what to believe, I'm telling them how biologists have drawn the conclusions that they draw. I tell them that the book of Job leads them to expect their faith to be tested. And if their faith is being tested by the evidence seeming to mean what it doesn't, then they're free to believe what they wish. So that's what faith is for. Faith is faith. You don't need faith to believe what the evidence suggests. You need faith to believe what the evidence doesn't suggest, and you're free to do that.
Science class is not to stamp truth on one belief about humanity's origins. Instead, the purpose of science class is to teach us the laws that describe how systems behave in our world. Newton's laws of physics help us explain why and how an apple falls from a tree. Darwin's laws of selection explain why and how bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics, how we can create better wheat plants through artificial selection, and yes, how humankind is likely to have arisen. Teaching these applications of the laws of selection illustrate to students how understanding evolution can help us understand our world. I encourage the board to resist any effort to diminish the clarity or detract from the conclusions of these examples, since that undermines our students' ability to understand these laws.
Having read through some of the relevant sections in the material that was submitted to the State Board of Education for adoption by 14 publishers this year, I testify that these materials largely represent mainstream opinions regarding the pattern and process of evolution. K through 12 students who've mastered these concepts, as currently written, should be well prepared to begin advanced study at colleges and universities. And I further testify that these publications are in full compliance, as far as I can tell, with all the relevant TEKS, the curriculum standards adopted by the State Board of Education. My opinion notwithstanding, it's reasonable for the State Board of Education, the Texas Education Agency, to invite additional review by the top researchers and educators in the field. The universities and research institutions in Texas employ world-leading educators and scientists of evolutionary theory. But these experts have largely been passed over. Inexplicably, few of those chosen to review these materials have any expertise in the field of evolutionary biology at all. And it's worse, too many of them hold views that are not only poor reflections of mainstream science, but are egregiously wrong. And these reviewers would not seek to strengthen science standards, but would weaken them. And that's not in the interest of the state of Texas. So we've come really far in the last 5 years in establishing a strong scientific curriculum. And our progress should be forward. Students who are misled about the meaning and explanatory power of evolutionary theory are at a competitive disadvantage. The impact of evolutionary theory extends to fields of engineering, medicine, public health, forensics, agriculture, computer science, and many, many others. It's time to stop listening to the pundits, the politicians, and the ideologues. And if we're looking for plumbers, it's good to not put a classified ad out seeking nominations for a plumber, but just hire a plumber. So I think it's time to start listening to the experts when considering reviews that are coming up.
All right, thank you. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Brown.
Professor, so whenever I'm trying to understand the criteria under which you would approve a reviewer.
okay? Because what I'm hearing here is that even if they are an expert, if too many of them hold views that are poor reflections of mainstream science, then that excludes them?
I would argue that the reviewers who have those fringe views are not experts, and so I would exclude them absolutely.
Okay, and so as we're making a determination as to whether or not, what you're telling me is we're no longer, by your criteria, we're no longer looking for experts, but we're looking for only experts who hold mainstream views. Is that correct?
Yes, these are textbooks. We're not talking about Discover magazine. We're talking about textbooks which seek to publish only mainstream scientific.
Yeah, I know what we're reviewing, but my question, I'm trying to understand yours and maybe some other folks in here, the criteria by which we would allow a person to review these textbooks. Some folks have said only experts. You're saying only experts that hold a particular viewpoint.
Well, one way that you can judge that is by if they've actually published.
Let him finish. Let him finish his sentence.
Really wasn't finished.
Thank you.
I did pause there for a moment, so I can see why you thought that I was done, but I wasn't. And so only those who hold a particular viewpoint are qualified as determined by who?
Well, we could say as determined by their publication record. If they've managed to publish their findings in a peer-reviewed scientific journal that goes against the mainstream, they may be a valued voice. But I don't think we're talking about those people.
Okay, so just to clarify then, in what we all hold to be a public process, I have heard that and I think you agree with that, right? This should be a public process?
Sure.
So in a public process, the only folks that would be allowed to review would be published experts who hold mainstream views. Is that right?
I agree with the former testifier that the public enters in the process in that the process is transparent to the public. Right? We don't all get a chance to fix the street if the street is broken, right? We hire people who know how to fix the street.
But otherwise we exclude them from the process.
We exclude people who don't know how to fix the street from the process, absolutely. We let them see who's fixing the street, but we don't allow them to do it because they don't know what they're doing.
Like the other, according to your criteria, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well then, as I said to the other reviewer, thank you for your time. Appreciate you being here, but you and I will have to agree to disagree.
Sure.
My first encounter with this board was at a debate for the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. I've attached a summary of my rebuttal of those alleged weaknesses. The worst part of my opponent's behavior in that debate, and which is relevant here, was when he told me that there were a number of transitional fossils he was aware of, but that he wanted to teach students that there were none. He said it was important that they believed that there were none. He knew better, but he admitted his intent to mislead students anyway. And now I read that one of our reviewers would like our textbooks to tell the same lie. My testimony cites a detailed zoological description of hundreds of unambiguous transitions, even according to the strictest definition of that word, just from within vertebrate paleontology alone. That list is also 20 years old, so I posted a video called The Ninth Foundational Falsehood of Creationism, wherein I showed dozens of additions discovered since. The 15th episode of that series explains what a scientific theory is, and one should be educated in that before advising others on how to be educated on it. But our reviewer says that students should be taught alternative theories to evolution. There are none. Evolution is the only explanation of biodiversity with either evidentiary support or measurable accuracy, while intelligent design creationism meets exactly none of the criteria required of a scientific theory. We know and can show that evolution is literally a fact of life. We know it works, we know how it works, we can see it work, and there's several ways to measure, test, and trace it, and there's practical advantage in understanding the realities involved. The point is, we cannot ask and should not expect textbook publishers to misrepresent the facts and deliberately deceive our children in order to cater to those who do not know or do not care what the truth really is.
Thank you.
As an educator and researcher who has spent my entire career working in the biological sciences, I can assure you that there is absolutely no legitimate controversy as to whether evolution occurred. Those who pretend otherwise either don't understand the science or are promoting a religious or political agenda. These agendas do not belong in a science classroom. Using science as an education as a political battleground hurts students, schools, and hurts Texas. Understanding evolution is critical for anyone who wants to be employed in a STEM field. I say this from practical experience. It would be impossible for anyone in my field to do top-level work without a rigorous understanding of how evolutionary processes shaped human genetic diversity. And this is also true of medicine and agriculture and many other fields. We don't teach evolution out of hostility to religion. We teach it because it's true, because it works, and because it's necessary for making scientific progress.
It may be inconvenient to your personal beliefs that life on this planet evolved and that no compelling evidence has been demonstrated to the contrary. But the evolutionary theory has accurately predicted testable and falsifiable conditions and contributed to the well-being of everyone in this room. We've seen benefits in agriculture, genetics, geology, biology, and virtually every field of science. Evolution is literally who we are. The next time you need medical care, your life could be saved because of the science of evolution. It is our history and it is our future. Those who have problems with this theory should have the courage to take their issues to the appropriate arena rather than risk stunting all of our prospects by politicizing their sensitivities to reality.
In 2009, for TEACS 2B, or B2, the SBOE adopted the National Academy of Science Excellent definition of science. The whole text defines science the same and goes on to say, quote, "There are no time machines that can take us back to the beginning of the universe so that we can watch it form." But then, repeatedly make speculative and worse yet, dogmatic statements. For example, quote, "Single-cell prokaryotes and later eukaryotes evolved and flourished in Precambrian time. The accumulation of atmospheric oxygen allowed organisms to become larger and live on land." This isn't observable, it's not repeatable, it's not testable. It's a dogmatic statement of truth. Not only do these statements ignore TEACS B2 and its own definition of science, the real problem of Holt and McGraw curriculums is that they're still teaching their children 19th century science and ignoring TEACS 3A, all science of theories, with 21st century science. These texts speak of no oxygen, or fail to mention current science has determined that without oxygen there would not have been an ozone layer, which could not have allowed for amino acids to create life. The texts speak of natural selection, but ignore the modern discoveries of complex designs of hormones, blood clotting, the eye, cell, etc. That is, the current science of irreducible complexity. The texts ignore the fact that we now know DNA of an organism is books and books of information. And to paraphrase two scientists, to assume that DNA is in an organism came from natural selection is like assuming a tornado went through a junkyard and completed a Learjet. The texts speak of the tree of life based on similarity, but ignores current molecular science and finds organisms that appear similar can be controlled by genes that are dissimilar, or identical genes controlling different characteristics, suggesting two new trees of life. What are we to believe? Well, this board made a decision to let children decide what to believe based on presenting all sides of theories. TEACS 3A.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My name is Gary Bennett with the Center for the Preservation of American Ideals. I also chair the Ethics and Religious Liberties Committee of First Baptist Church of Dallas. I'm here to speak in support of the inclusion of intelligent design in our science textbooks. I've heard it said here today that to put anything of creationism in would be a violation of the Establishment Clause deciding separation of church and state. And you're very correct, the comments made, you're not going to find that clause, separation of church and state, in the Constitution. A phrase taken out of Thomas Jefferson's letter to the group of Baptists by a lazy Supreme Court law clerk in 1947 prepping for Everson First Board of Education, which turned the entire meaning of the Establishment Clause upside down. But if you wish to adhere to that erroneous viewpoint, I would submit that if you exclude intelligent design and only include evolution, then in many respects, by that exclusion, you are acting as a government body against a religious viewpoint. It could be argued that you're violating the Establishment Clause in that respect too. So how do you reconcile it? Include both. Put intelligent design in side by side with evolution. Institute for Creation Research has compiled massive scientific evidence to support intelligent design. Let the facts speak for themselves. If you want to engage students in legitimate debate, let them see both sides of the argument and let them decide for themselves. To exclude one in favor of the other is a rather narrow-minded viewpoint in what we're teaching our students today. And that basically is the point that I wish to make to you today.
Thank you. Mr. Ratliff?
Which version of creationism would you propose that we include?
Biblical truth.
So not other religions' versions of creation?
No, I would say that you ought to, you can put in others as well, as long as there's scientific evidence to support it, and let the facts speak for themselves, and let the students make up their own mind. But give them a balanced viewpoint, not a narrow-minded viewpoint by excluding everything else to be only in evolution.
So if other faiths can bring forward what they view as scientific evidence of their version of the creation, then we would include that as well?
But the real meaning of the Establishment Clause was that the country should make no established religion like the Church of England, and that everyone should be free to have their own religious beliefs in this country. And so I think to be totally inclusive would be an appropriate approach.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure.
Mr. Bradley?
Well, unfortunately, I think the decision was made 4 years ago when we adopted, or 5 years ago, the TEACS, which is the curriculum that the publishers are having to follow. And as I remember, and I guess I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but what we did successfully include was the requirement that the child investigate both the strengths and weaknesses of theories. If evolution is a theory, that's fine. Publishers only have a requirement now to let, we need to go talk back to the legislature, but they're only requiring that these publishers include 51% of the instructional materials in order to get this seal of good housekeeping. And so, 51% of the TEACS, one of the TEACS is the requirement on strengths and weaknesses. So we keep getting sandbagged.
Understand?
Friends, my name is Arthur Stewart, and I'm the senior minister of Midway Hills Christian Church in Dallas, Texas. I'm an ordained pastor, and I want to say right now, I believe we need to teach evolution in our schools as presented herein to this board, without strengths and weaknesses, backdoors to creationism or intelligent design, or any other caveats or created problems. And it's for this simple reason: the sun does not stop. In the 10th chapter of Joshua, the text tells us that Joshua called on the sun to stand still, and it did. That is the explanation of a geocentric viewpoint, that the earth is the center of the universe, and that the sun and everything else revolves around it. We know, thanks to the discovery of folks like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, that we in fact live in a heliocentric system in which the earth revolves around the sun. The sun cannot stand still in the sky unless the earth stops, and were the earth to stop, we would all be flung through the atmosphere into space to our respective deaths. But this does not happen in the book of Joshua.
Theology is the most speculative of all philosophy. Its source is divine knowledge. And because of the greater worth of its subject matter, the sublimity of it transcends human reason. That transcends human reason. Now, Aquinas also said that wonder is the desire of knowledge, and both science and philosophy seek to fulfill that desire. But science has a limit. Science is limited only to human reason. Anything that transcends human reason, therefore, cannot be science. And to attempt to force this divine, which transcends reason, into the small confines of reason alone, not only makes a general mess of science, but also diminishes divine. It lowers the supernal to the study of the terrestrial, and that's a little blasphemous.
I'm against additions of scientifically unproven, unrelated religious dogma into science textbooks. Evolution is the foundation of modern biology. The theory of evolution not only says that life evolved, it also includes mechanisms like mutations, natural selection, and genetic drift, which go a long way towards explaining how life evolved. Evolution is supported by a wide range of observations throughout the fields of genetics, anatomy, ecology, animal behavior, paleontology, and others. Texas students with a good foundation of understanding how life forms evolve in order to be successful in future science careers, such as the medical field. Children reading these books will be your doctors and nurses in 20 years. Do you want them to be familiar with the basics of science and how the body functions? They should have access to the most current methods and medications, which have been developed by people whose education was also dependent on basic biological knowledge, which all relies on evolution. Flu vaccines are different every year because viruses evolve quickly. Understanding the mechanism of evolution on a larger scale, such as the evolution of humans, makes it easier to apply that concept to evolution on a smaller scale, such as viruses and bacteria. Texas students need an educational foundation, a better understanding of science. Why are we spending all this energy hindering their access to knowledge, when we should be working on finding better access so these children can grow up understanding how the world works, so they can grow up to make it a better place? Thank you.
4 years ago, Zach Coplin, who we heard from today, a lifelong friend of mine, asked me to testify in front of the Louisiana Education Committee. That was the day I learned about the LSCA, or the Louisiana Science Education Act, an act that opened science classrooms and textbooks to pseudoscience, supported by creationist organizations, including the Discovery Institute. I'm not here to argue random creationist points because they seem to constantly evolve. No one here can deny that 99% of the scientific community, 78 Nobel laureates, and tens of thousands of clergy members support evolution with decades of evidence. There is no controversy. Since the LSCA was signed into law, it has brought negative press to Louisiana, tarnished its reputation in the public education, and has led to a scientific convention leaving New Orleans. Now in Texas, the so-called expert review panel includes someone employed by a creationist think tank. As a student in Houston, I implore you members of the board to protect our science textbooks and consider your constituents and our state for 3 reasons. Texas cannot allow similar consequences to arise as a direct result of compromised legislative decisions. Texas also cannot allow our healthy job market to be betrayed. This is a country whose main business is intellectual property, science, and technology, and that is the future we are heading towards. And finally, Texas cannot allow our students to be ill-equipped for the world in which they will need a fundamental background in evolution to solve our toughest medical and energy challenges. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you. Brian Ferguson, followed by Morgan Walter.
Good afternoon, or should I say evening. My name is Reverend Brian Ferguson. I am the Minister of the San Marcos Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, which is 30 miles south of here. I hold a Master's of Divinity degree and a BSc Honours degree in Applied Physics with a specialty in biophysics. Prior to entering the ministry, I worked as an electronic design engineer for over 24 years, working in high-performance computers, mainly designed for research in biotechnology. I stand before you as someone whose both personal and professional life has been and continues to be greatly enhanced by both religion and science. I am also the father of a 10-year-old daughter who is currently in the Austin public school system and is passionate about science. I speak strongly and passionately in support of adopting our biology science textbooks as they currently stand. The science supporting evolution and climate change is clear, and continued research, which is a requirement of science, only supports them. Evolution is good, but perhaps not perfect science. And though it challenges some people's religious perspective, it is their religious belief that challenges and not scientific reality. I appreciate it can be difficult for some people's heartfelt beliefs to be challenged, but that is not a guide to scientific curriculum. We cannot let some people's opinions obstruct the facts of science in good 21st century mainstream science education. We do no favours to our children's education or the credibility of our education system by confusing the roles of science and religion. Religion is obviously of great importance to me, as with many others here today, but our science textbooks should teach the best, most up-to-date scientific knowledge we have. I strongly urge the adoption of the science textbooks we have, especially the biology textbooks, which have been approved by science scholars knowledgeable in the field. Thank you for your time and your patience.